Okay, hope you can see that. So when we're talking about climate crisis and how we deal with that, and we understand that this is something that we obviously deal emotionally and physically, and our body and soul is part of what's going on. Many research is made about how our body affects our soul, and we know that from many things. There is actually a impact of climate change on human health in general, and they from the Center of Disease Control in the US, and they already shared some things like the heat wave that we're experiencing. You can see that on the left side. Heat wave affect our body, which obviously we can all feel today, but heat wave all not affect only our body, it affects also our soul and our emotions. And it's very important for us to understand that it's not just something that is going on around us that the body reacts to. We also, our behavior, our mind react to that. And we can see that here, we can talk about a heat wave and not talking about raising the violence or the feeling of conflict. Actually, we're feeling that we're more, the energy is different, and we can all feel it, this week. But we can also see that there is an increase of conflict, not just between people, also between groups. And when we understand that, we can understand that there are things that may happen to us when we feel that there is a heat wave around us, or there is the climate change getting warmer around us. I wanna say that it's not something that is just a feeling that we can say, okay, this is kind of a culture. We live in a certain country that behave like that. We can see that, as you can see here, all over. It doesn't matter who are those people and where they live, as long as they feel 4% of increase as long as they feel the increase of the temperature, there is an increase in conflict. There is an increase in violence around them. We can see that many things or many terms relate to the crisis, the climate crisis, while we deal with the mental health. Ecological anxiety, climate grief, climate depression, pre-traumatic stress disorder, all of those relate mainly to how we feel about knowing and learning about the crisis. So when we talk about a crisis and when we understand that there is a crisis and there are many things that's going to happen around us, we actually build some kind of emotions and feelings around it. And it's focused on more anxiety and grief. It's about how we gonna say goodbye to things that we used to see or things that we used to feel. It's how we gonna change the feeling or the knowing that the world around us is going to change, that our climate will change, that our view will change. When we hear about the possibility of the extreme events around us, there is kind of a fear that around it. So it's the pre-traumatic disorder or those things relate to the feelings when we know there is a climate crisis and when we know that there are things that's going to happen around us that will affect us and will affect our life. I want to relate today not about what we know that's going to happen, more about how we can expect or what can we expect while we already feeling the climate crisis around us. We can talk, I think mainly today when we talk about what's going on around the world, we can't say that things that's going on around us going to happen in the future. We already part of it. It's already part of our life. It's already around us. So when we talk about the climate crisis, we talk about sequence of various events, various disasters that's going to happen in our life or happening in our life or can happen around the world. We don't know exactly which one of them going to happen where and exactly how many times and when it's going to be, but we understand that when we talk about climate crisis, it's not just one thing that's going to happen for us. And I think it's interesting, the set of mind is interesting because it's not the first time that the world will, experience a fire or a drought or a war or, a flood. All of those things, happened in the past, and it's not new for us, or it's not new for the world. The difference is that it's not going to be once in a while. It's going to be much more intensive. It's going to be much more dramatic. It's going to be in many places that maybe never experienced that in the past. So we're not talking about the flood. We're talking about the climate crisis that includes floods and drought and fires and all of that. And this is, and it's important for us to remember that, because mental health know how to deal with a flood. At least experienced dealing with flood, or dealing with a fire, or how people react to a war or drought or things like that. It's not new for us. It's not new for the world. So what's new here? Why do we talk about it as something that is different? I think it's like, and I brought this because I think it's kind of a set that help us to understand it. It's like, eating a carrot or a broccoli or an onion. We can eat each one of them separately. We know how they taste. We know what does it mean for us to eat a carrot. But the carrot is not the same when it's part of a soup. And when we eat the soup, the carrot, even if we'll eat only the carrots that are in the soup, they are different. And if we'll eat the broccoli, it's different. And absolutely, if you're going to eat the soup itself. So it means that there is something, when we put all of them together, when we mix all of them together, that they affect each other. It's not just one thing. It's not just one event or one disaster that we have to deal with. It's how that one disaster affects the second, and how the second affects the third, and what does it mean? And when we talk about many, we actually talk about something that is much more wider than just dealing with a flood. And it's the same thing about how our soul reacts, because our soul will react one time for a carrot, and another way, and maybe in a bit another way to a broccoli, but it's going to be different when it's going to have both of them together, or the flood and the fire a while after it. So understand that this is talking about those things means that carrot itself, or let's switch it, okay, to those. We can talk about it now. When we talk about fire itself, and a flood or a drought or whatever crisis we have to face, we're talking about a syndrome of events. And when we talk about how we feel about one thing or another, it's not just a trauma, one trauma. It's actually something that includes another trauma and another trauma, and one trauma affects other. And when we understand that the first trauma will affect the second, and the second affect the third, and maybe there are a few that happening in different places all over the world at the same time, it means that it's not over. And one thing that actually make the difference between a trauma and a trauma that is not, it's still going on, it's the ongoing trauma that we're going to call it ongoing trauma. It's the trauma that continues. It's not a one event that ends. It's not one thing that ended and now we can relate to it as something that is part of our past. It's actually something that's still going on. Maybe not in the same shape, maybe not in the same way, maybe in a little bit different, happening in a different atmosphere, but it's still part of our life. It may be, and we'll get to that later, it may be not even in the same place, but still it's part of the feeling that we're part of this trauma or this event still that didn't end yet. That is, and when we know it's going to happen again, and when we know it's still going on, we're facing our feeling and our fear again and again. And it's written here, and I think it's very interesting to understand it. It's not necessarily if we're in danger or not. it's even if we feel that it's not the realistic, there is a realistic threat of the present and future danger. We feel that it's not necessarily that we're in a danger right now, but we're in danger that will continue, will happen again, or may happen soon again. And this is something for us to understand that, and to say it's not just a trauma that we dealt before. Because when we talk about ongoing trauma and continuous trauma, there are things like the soup, if we're going back to that, it's a different taste. There are things that characterize ongoing trauma and continuous trauma that are a little bit different. Some of them are more dramatic, some of them are a bit different from just the trauma itself. And when we talk about, and we mentioned before, the pre-traumatic trauma, part of it is that we understand that there will be a trauma in our future. And we know that there is something that's going to be very dramatic. We don't know necessarily how to get ready to that, or how to prepare to that. And when we understand that this is a trauma that was in the past but will be in the future, we're actually mixing both of them together, the pre and the post, and we're going to live for a while in both, in pre and past, in the past and in the future at the same time, with things that we have to relate that ended, but things that we know that's going to happen to us in the future, and maybe in the near future as well. I want to stop for a second. Just, I don't know, I don't see that actually, and I don't know how to get to that. Let's see if we have an option. Let's stop share. I'm sorry that it's more like, okay. Okay, I'll try to see the chat the same time, or at least be able to read it in the same time. If you have questions or things that relate to that, and we'll stop every few minutes or every few times during. Okay. Oh, okay. There is a remark here about guilt. You feel guilt. We'll get to the guilt in a second. If we drive and actually, or if we do things the way we live today, and how that affect the climate crisis, and that we're part of its consequences as well. Okay. So we're going to call it from now an ongoing trauma, not just a trauma, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk a little bit about what does it mean, an ongoing trauma, because I think it's understanding that it's a little bit different from the trauma that we all, or at least the psychology know how to relate to today much better than 10 or 20 years ago. There are some things that we need to understand that are a little bit, or we need to focus on them and see the differences. One of them is the unknown. When trauma is over, when we talk about trauma like a war or something like that, when somebody went, to a soldier that got back and has talk about his experience in the combat, or even civilians, and we have a lot of examples from working in the South. There is a rocket attack, and after that, people ask for help. The rocket attack ended. I mean, usually we say, okay, it's over. We can breathe now. We can relate to what's going on right now. It's done. It's not here yet. It's not here anymore. And here we're talking about something that we are talking about the unknown. We can't promise that we won't have it again. We see that, and I gave the example of the South because I think part of that is what we already experiencing around Gaza, and talking about rockets attacked one after another in a very short breaks in between. Every round is for itself, but still we can't say it's over, it won't happen again. We all, in a way, understand that it's just a matter of time. And we see that people react to that differently. They get back to life very fast, and at the same time, there is a level of anxiety, a level of a trauma that they still, post-trauma, that they still react to some things that they can't, or it's not the same, like saying, okay, it's over, it's done, we get back to our life again. Knowing that you have to be always ready for the next thing brings your emotions to a level that you're already in a tension, in a constant tension of understanding that this is something that it's not, we're going to get to the slideshow, that it's not knowing that you have to be ready. It may happen, or something may happen soon again. Put you in a situation that you're not comfortable and can say, okay, I'm safe. The feeling of safetyness is a little bit different, or very different, from knowing that something was ended and now you can deal or take care for yourself. But this is one thing I think understanding that this is intensive and ongoing. But the third thing, and we experienced that during the COVID, it's global. It may be global, like a pandemic that we just experienced here now, but it may be something that's happening, different things that are happening around the world at the same time. What does it mean for us when there are few things that are happening at the world at the same time? How our resources are available to help each other. And it's very important, because when part of what we plan is when we have a disaster, we can evacuate people from one place to another. We can get some help from other countries around the world. But if all of us, or a lot of us, face different catastrophes or different extreme events at the same time, are we available to each other? Can we really help each other? Can we send, and we just saw it when we didn't have enough machines or even enough tests for the COVID, how hard it was to get them. It's not that some countries decided that they don't send to others, or they don't share it with other countries. Each country tried to get as much as or as many as they can. So it feels like something that we can't trust that other people will help us. Other communities, other countries, other organizations. We're part of a global world, but at the same time, we have to be able to face it and trust that we can do that ourselves, and not necessarily get the help from others at the same time, because it may be different things and that's happening at the same time in different places, but they still don't give us, we can't get the help that we need from one place to another. In general, when we deal with something over and over again, and when we have to face a trauma after trauma after trauma that are very intensive, and we don't have the time in between, or we have a very little time in between, our resources are ending. It's not like trauma after trauma breaks us. It's typical to think that trauma, if we experience trauma and then we'll have to face another one, then we are stronger to face the second or the third. But actually, part of what happens is that we lose our resources. It's like, think about somebody that had to spend a lot of money to take care for something now. It doesn't mean that if there's a crisis in 2 weeks or in 2 months or even in a year, it's not necessarily that we'll have enough money to do that again. So when we just put so much money on, our healthcare and our health system to take care for COVID, what does it mean if we'll have to face something else in a few months? How our system will deal with that. It's the same thing about our soul. How much energy do we have? How much energy to face the next thing or the next disaster we have? I had a privilege to talk to different people at the beginning of COVID around the world. I worked with the people in different countries, and it was very interesting to talk to people that are in places that just had kind of a disaster a few months ago. Like I've talked with people in Australia. What does it mean to have the COVID now in Australia when they just faced a few months ago the fires? I mean, do you get to those, to face this situation with the same resources that we have, not facing those fires or facing it very little a year ago? What does it mean for people in South America while they have some troubles, some countries, some political problems that they have to face with their leaders, and we'll talk about leaders in a second, but in general, how they deal with their political situation, which is very complicated anyway. What does it mean for them now to get into this situation? And we saw that even here, dealing with COVID in Israel or the corona in Israel was different. If it's different when we talk, when we have a government that is working and we can, work with it, or in a situation like we got it when it was in the middle, elections and all this political situation that was very confusing for about a year. So the whole system get to the situation in a different way and face it in a different way. And the same thing about us as individuals or as communities. If we put all our energies now taking care for the COVID, we emotionally, it's going to be harder for us to face the next or the second one. And even when we talk now about the second wave, look how a lot of us react, like how much energy do we have to face the second wave if we'll have to do that in a month or 2 or 3 or even in the next winter. I've said it earlier, but I wanna emphasize that a little bit deeper. It's not necessarily that I have to face the disaster here. I mean, having that in Israel is one thing, and it's definitely, if I physically get through a disaster, this is definitely the highest way to feel it. But today we're talking about seeing even disasters, and in a world that we have, the world in our hand. Literally, we can see everything that's happening all over the world, almost minute by minute in our homes. If I am sitting here in Israel and seeing the fires in Australia, or I see the refugees in Syria, or I see other disasters, or the hurricane in US, it means I can identify with things that I see. And when I identify with things and I express, or I feel that in a way, not in the same way like I'm there, but it's definitely get my anxiety and my fears. And in a way, I can identify with the sufferer, with the feelings that I see with the people. When we saw, and a lot of us saw the pictures, I think it was very strong, seeing the fires in Australia. That's why I mention it over and over. Seeing even the animals that faced the fire there, how hurt it was, how painful it was to see that, and knowing that it's something, having fires near my house is a possibility. Not necessarily that I had it, but even knowing that it's a possibility, make the level of my anxiety grows. So knowing about disaster around the world and feeling it and facing it, in a way, it's a one line. It's not necessarily that I have to face it physically to be able to understand that this is something that is already here and already intimidate my life and my secure. And again, when I talk about and when I talk about the feeling unsecure and feeling that it's still going on, it's part of it. I don't know why that happened to me. Let's try this. Okay. So when we go and we talk about ongoing trauma, we're talking about something that is and the climate crisis, of course, as part of it, it's an ongoing, it's repeated, it's not something that I can say it's done, relax, you won't feel it again, it won't happen again. It's something that can happen more than one time. It probably will happen more than one time, and I'll experience that in different way. It's a real threat or a perceived threat. I can see that on the television and still feel like I'm threatened by what I saw and by the disasters I just saw on the TV right now, or people can talk about things that happened. And I already can feel like it may happen to me as well. I may experience that here. There is a potential that the place I live in can suffer from the same thing, even though it didn't happen necessarily right now here in my place. So the fear and the anxiety grows with it. The threat is sudden. This is part of trauma. We don't know when it's going to happen. If it was expected, it's not necessarily a traumatic event. We can predict and prepare for it. Of course, unexpected and intensive. And the ongoing part of that is that I don't have enough time to get ready, and I don't have enough time to recover necessarily from what I experienced or from what's going on. I see that there are more things in the chat, so we'll get back to the chat for a second. Okay, what ההבדל בין טראומות מתמשכות באזורי מלחמה ואזורי אקלים. Well, I'll talk about the difference between war and ecological. יכול להיות שיש הבדל מתחושת האובדן למה שאני רואה. I'm not sure I understand the question. So, Gil, okay, I'll answer the first one and then we'll get, I think you have to expand your question a little bit. The difference between trauma in a war zone and in ecological disasters, it depends. There are a lot of similarities as long as we're talking about an ongoing, something that's happening again and again. A war zone and the feeling, and I gave the example of Gaza, this is something that we know, that people know in general what to expect. And this may be the difference. So it's still traumatic and we don't know when, it's still going on, and it's the ongoing situation. But we know rockets in the south, okay? People know how they have to react to rocket. When they hear the siren, the red siren, the siren, צבע אדום, red color, they know what they have to do. What we're talking about, ecological disasters, that it's not necessarily going to be the same thing. Once it may be a flood, but it can be that the next time going to be a fire, or next time going to be I don't know, whatever, something else. So it's not necessarily the same situation. So getting ready or predict what I need to do and get prepared for it is much more complicated. I think that's the main thing. There may be more differences. Part of the problem of the ecological, and again, it's if we have the same thing, it's the same ecological. I mean, if we know that there is a hurricane and we'll experience hurricane and we just don't know when, it's very similar to a war zone. Again, we know what to expect. There are differences between a human being created this suffering, or the nature. There are different reactions for that a little bit. There are things that we say, or feel a little bit, maybe feel a little bit different when it's something that made by people, like war, and something that made by nature. And that may be a little bit different between how we perceive the trauma, but still a trauma. For our discussion right now, we won't get into that. The feeling that there is something that's going on that is very dramatic for me, and it's something that I have to face and deal with, and it's new for me, and I don't know how to deal with. This is, I think, what we're going to see more than we saw before. I don't know who's Gil, but Gil, if you want to ask, no, Gil, who was it? Yeah, oh, it's the same person. I didn't understand the question. יש הבדל בין תחושת אובדן.
יש הבדל בין תחושת אובדן, שאני יכול להסתכל בטלוויזיה ולהיות מודע למה שקורה, שהכל מת, ובין חוויה ממשית של גירוי מאוד חזק בזמן טראומה. כלומר, הטראומה היא לא רק האיום על הביטחון שלי, אלא עוצמה של גירוי מסוים, עוצמה של גירוי שלילי. ואני אומר, להיזהר לא לערבב ביניהם בעצם. אובדן זה דבר אחד, טראומה זה, למרות שבעצם אובדן יכול להוביל לטראומה וטראומה. ולפעמים לא ברור לי מתי את מדברת על מה, אז פשוט ככה...
I'll relate to the trauma, אני מתייחסת רגע לטראומה. אובדן or I'm going to relate to the trauma for the event itself. Seeing an event on a TV may be very frightening. Seeing a movie is one thing, seeing news is something else. It affects me in a different way because I can feel that this is, I can identify with it. I can say, and this is part of what news try to do for us. I mean, the reporters try to bring it as emotional as possible for us to identify with. And many times they do succeed. We do identify with people that suffer in the other side of the world. Now, it doesn't mean that I feel it the same way like it happened here, or I see it happening in front of my eyes. I said it before, it's not the same level, but it's still part of the same line. So it's not the grief that I'm talking about right now. Of course, if there is an additional thing, like I'm a loss of, or a grief or something that relate to that, that's in addition to. I'm talking about just the fear for my life, knowing that I'm on threat right now, and I may be, it's a potential threat for me. That's frightening. That increase the level of stress that I feel. And by that, I made this connection. But you consider it as a trauma, and that's where I don't understand. It affects, of course, it relate to the stress, the feeling of stress, and that's a higher potential for me for trauma. It's a higher level of stress that I'm feeling. It's not like I'm seeing that everything is very nice and comfortable and calm right now, and I feel very secure at my home, and I see that it's secure. I can feel very comfortable and secure at my home, and at the same time seeing that there is a, I'm not sure a hurricane is the right example for us as Israelis, but in general, I can see a hurricane in US and see people who lose their houses and see how they suffer and see their loss, not my loss, and still identify with their grief and pain. And that increased my stress. It's not a traumatic event for itself for me. It just added to my stress and my resiliency, or a feeling that I'm more resilient to this situation. Exactly. Okay. Okay. Is this what a secondary trauma is? Maybe explain. Will relate. Oh, I don't know if I'm the only one who see the secondary trauma. Maybe it's for me. I'll relate a secondary trauma later. We'll see. You know, I'll relate to that in a second. You know what? I'll say something about it. Maybe it's important to say that. When we talk, and I think that relate to the former question about what I see on TV and how it's not necessarily my loss, but it's other people's loss. Research that made with the people that are first responders. It's not their loss, but they are the people who were there, the first responders who react to those situations. We're talking about police, firefighters, medical treatment, that medical supporter and things like that. People that get to those places and see those people and see these suffer, although they were not part of the event, they were not there when things happen, they're still much more vulnerable for post-traumatic stress, for example. We see a lot of people in a war zone. It's very, not just in a war zone, actually, we see that in ecological disasters as well, that people that were first responders in those events, many times, or a lot of them, may react more strong or in a higher way or higher stress to the situation. And when we see people who suffer from post-trauma, we see a bunch of people that were first responders or worked as first responders from few reasons. One, and even though they were not those people who experienced that directly, though they saw that very, very close, they identify with those people, and that's related to the question about what we see in media. But another thing is that seeing that over and over again, being there, and first responders are people that many times, going to accidents or seeing and helping in accident more than one time, they see this suffer, they see this pain over and over again. And when they see this pain, it's not like we're getting used to this pain. It's not like we're saying, you saw that before, it's nothing for you. You saw that before. It's like something that it's on your skin already. It's kind of like it's getting deeper and deeper. And at a certain point, it may get into you. It may get something that you're not just, you can't just avoid and say, done, I'm behind it, I'm back in my safe home. So dealing with those situations over and over teach us how we react to situations that we see and understand. Again, and it's different when you see that, you know, face to face, and it's different when you see that on TV, but still the way that you identify with that, the way you see that over and over again makes its own influence. I'll get back to the slide because there are some things that I want to say about resiliency, and we'll get back to questions later. So we're talking about ongoing trauma, something that is not necessarily over, but what do we do with that? And I want to relate a little bit to resiliency and what does it mean when we talk about the resilience or our resilience to be able to deal with those situations. How resilient we get to those situations. Now, I think we say resiliency, and people, you know, very easily say we're a resilient community, we're a resilient country, we're resilient people. We are resilient in one way or another. Resiliency is not yes or no. It's different levels of resiliency. One problem that we already said, that we not necessarily are able to increase or work on our resiliency from one event to another, since they are more often and more intensive than we used to deal with them in the past. So this is part of what affect our resiliency. But there are different things that build our resiliency, and I think it's interesting to see them again in the situation that we live right now. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years or even less, but we can look, you know, and see what do we know today, what are the things that we can predict or deal with in the future, and how that brings us or how that affects our resiliency. So one of the things that we saw there is leadership. And I think after, you know, I'm trying not to get into politics, but in a way, all over the world, we can say that there is a kind of a crisis of leadership. And it's not necessarily one country or another, it's kind of a global problem today. Can we trust our leaders? Trust the leader is not just because I need to know that he leads me in the right way. Think about what we saw just in COVID now and during the Corona now. If we didn't trust our leadership, the fact that they told all of us that we have to stay at home, that there is a quarantine, I don't think, I mean, we could get outside. Yeah, we could get tickets, but in a certain point, you know, we could get outside. We could do different things. And you can see that now when people now want to get out, they just get out. I mean, they do whatever they want, even if our leaders say don't do that or do just this and keep, you know, coffee shops closed, restaurants closed. If somebody decided to open and decided that it doesn't trust the government or the authorities anymore, or our leaders anymore, they do what they want. But it's much more important if we want to to make sure that the community reacts in a certain way. Do run to shelters. It's a dangerous time. You have to evacuate. You have to evacuate your houses because of a fire, because of a flood. If we give an order as leaders, evacuate your house to keep your safetyness, do we listen to those leaders? Do we trust those leaders? Can we work with that? There is no way to deal with the crisis like we're talking about if we don't have a community that follow the leadership. And if there's a leadership that we don't trust, it's much more complicated, because then we may decide that each one of us chooses his own leader or the own voice that he wants to take. Now, in terms of when we talk about the climate crisis, I think it's much more problematic. we already, and I just put the photo from the conference in Madrid, but it's like the climate, when those leaders couldn't get or couldn't reach any decision together to face the climate crisis. But and that means something about their open, and their how they relate to this climate crisis, and how they understand that we have to get prepared for some things, and we have to do some things to prevent other catastrophics around the world. But it's also when we as people, and especially young people, see that, what do we tell ourselves about our leaders, about their way to lead us to a safe future, to help us to deal with the crisis next time? When we look at the leaders during the COVID, those that were reacted fast, and those that didn't, and those that still don't know exactly how to react to that, what does it mean for us as people, as community? Who do we need to follow? What do we need to do? Can we find somebody else to follow? Now, I want to give an example. That's something that actually happened here in Israel only a few months ago. I hope, I don't know you, but and who are the people that are who each one of you, but there was a group, I think Shomrei Habayit is the name of the group, in the north, that tried to stop from the government to put the gas pipes in the north, or in front of the coast, north coast, in the sea. I don't know if I'm expressing, do I tell this story right? You know what I'm talking about the pipes, the gas pipes.
שומרי הבית ניסו למנוע מהאסדה שהקימו מול חופי פלמחים, כן.
נכון, זה לא מול פלמחים, מול חוף דור,
חוף.
באזור, כן.
בעצת אזור הכרמל.
אזור הכרמל. It's much easier to speak in Hebrew. Those pipes, the authorities, or at least the government in Israel, said it's safe enough, don't worry, it's okay. But people and organizations didn't trust them. And I don't want to get into who was right and who was wrong, but the fact that people were evacuated from their houses during the day that there was the beginning or the opening of those pipes, because they were not sure that the government, they couldn't trust the government, and they couldn't trust that the promise that the government gave them that it's safe enough, and evacuated for a few hours, for a day, for 2 days, for 48 hours, their houses, means that they didn't trust the authorities, means that they don't trust that authorities will keep their lives. They don't trust that the authorities get decisions that are good for our health. And if authorities do not get decisions, if our government do not get decisions not necessarily good for our health, compared to rich people, factories, other countries, whatever you'll put in this equation, it means that we get decisions for ourselves, by ourselves, or by people that we do trust. And people who we do trust may be two different people, or two kinds of people. They can be people that we know personally, so they may be even living with us, like this group. We live together, we trust each other, we all sure that we're all taking care for our health, because you won't tell me that it's not dangerous if you yourself live or have to breathe the same air. Okay, so if you breathe this air and you trust this air, I may trust you. It gives me more secure, more feeling of that I can trust you. I can trust what you say. But if you don't live with me, and you live in Jerusalem and I live in the north, and you're saying that my air is clean, it's not necessarily the same thing. Although it may be that you have the same, and I trust you already from other things as well, that you have the same agenda. So you could see that those groups trusted groups like them around the world and got a lot of information, and we'll get to it in a second, got a lot of information, a lot of help from groups, other groups around the world that gave, you know, knowledge. And I think even the machines to measure this air pollution, many things that they can ask people that they don't necessarily know, but they have the same agenda. So if you have the same agenda, I can trust you. If you have the same, if you are like me and you not like you live with me, and you'll get affected, but by your decisions the same way that I'll get affected, then I can trust you. But if not, I'm not necessarily can trust you, and that's an opening for a lot of chaos in times of crisis, because like we saw with, for example, חיסונים, I lost the word, חיסונים לחצבת. Like when people had to get the shot against vaccinations, but how do you say חצבת?
Measles.
Measles. Okay, so vaccination for measles. Thank you. That was very important for that people will trust the government, or people will trust the authorities, because if they trust friends that have the same agenda, that may be a threat for other people, or maybe a threat or an opening for a disaster that can happen because of it. So it's very complicated. If we don't trust, if we don't have a leadership that we can trust, there is an opening for it decrease our resiliency. I think it's important for us to know that. One of the things that we saw, and actually during the COVID, we saw that very nice, that we could see leaders that we can trust in different ways, but leaders who cannot show emotional intelligence, there is, it's important to say that too. If we have an ongoing trauma, if we have an ongoing situation, that it's not a one thing that happens, it's a crisis that is going on, then there are a lot of reasons why we can't trust our leaders. There are a lot of things that may happen for us not to trust our leaders. One, because if it's not a one thing and it's going over and over again, then it may be, we're all human, there may be mistakes or decisions that we think we disagree with, and we'll say, you know, I don't trust his way to get decisions or to decide. For example, we can see that now, closing all the, you know, schools and having a quarantine here. Was it necessary? Was it necessary? Was it not necessary? This whole discussion brings us, or bring thoughts, can we trust it again? So the feeling that we can't trust, or the mistrust to our leaders, increase while the situation is going on and on. But then if a leader, and in a certain point we could see that here, and I think it was a very nice and interesting and turn point, when the leaders say, I did a mistake, and I know that many people were suffered by that, but we are going to change it, and we understand it, and we'll change the way we react to situations. Or leaders say, and I think that was a very nice and small thing, but a lot of people talked about the Prime Minister in New Zealand, and how she was emotionally intelligent, how she showed her emotional intelligence to her people, talking about how they suffer and how they do. Now, the situation, the economic situation there is hard, almost as hard as here and in other places around the world. But the feeling is that we can trust this leader because the leader understands and goes with us. She's human, we're human. And our leaders, we know our leaders are human, but we have to know that they know what we are going through, and they understand, emotionally understand what we're going through. Trust of adults in general, and I think that's more specific for it may be in every teenagers can feel it, but I think in the climate crisis it's a little bit more, and it's related to the question that was before about shame. I think it's not a coincidence that we see a lot of young people active in this working or fighting the climate crisis and trying to help or change the situation. I think part of that, and I think that something that comes in between generations, the fact that they can look at our generation, and I feel comfortable enough to say our generations, and definitely those that were before me even, feel like we can trust them. They are the generations who created this problem, and we can change it immediately. Not like other things. It's not like we're going to change one thing in our life and we're with them and we can show them that, you know what, we totally understand and we will react differently so we can keep the world safe and clean. We do drive cars and we won't stop probably drive in one way or another. Maybe we'll drive less, but it's not like we won't use gas anymore. We will use, you know, plastic. We will use things that are still problematic to the climate, the situation around us, and we can't stop it immediately. We can't do things that will show them that we are with them immediately. And it's very easy, especially when you're a young person, to do a split, and you know, it's good and bad. And those adults they do not know how to deal with this situation. And we see, I think it's not a coincidence that we see Greta eventually a 16 years old or 17 years old girl, that she's the face of this attempt to stop leaders, and the one that can stand there and feel like I'm not part of the problem, I'm part of the solution, or I'm trying to be part of the solution, because all of us in a way feel like we're still part of the problem as well. And that increased, I think, the feeling that we're creating. And when we talk about trauma and we say, what did we do? Are we, you know, it's something that happened. It's outside of me. It's not outside of me. Feeling shame that I'm part of the problem who creates this, it's definitely part of the reason, like talking about war or something like that. And that's part of the differences between a war and a war zone and a climate disaster zone. That in a climate disaster zone, usually it's like, it's not us. Now we can't say it's not us. We're part of what's going on. It's more like a war and less like a disaster that is outside. I see that our time is, you know, quite short and actually almost done. So I'll stop here and get back for a second. If there are more questions or things that people want to bring up, we're going to give an option for that. Okay, so I'll you know, in a second just close. Talking about the climate crisis, I think we can't, as I said at the beginning, I think we can't talk about one trauma or one thing. We have to talk about something that is ongoing, and understanding that this has a characters for itself, and we have to understand it. There are places or there are examples that we can learn from, and I think especially us as Israelis that deal with or live in a place that suffers from trauma once in, I want to say a few years, but in some places few months or few weeks, know that or have some experience already. What are the things that we can see? The level of trauma or post-traumatic stress among people who suffer from ongoing trauma is higher and more dramatic than people who suffer from trauma or post-trauma, like our traditional way to see that, if there is a tradition here already. But it's a bit different. And the fact that we're dealing with something that we are part of, and it's going to be intensive and global, I think it's important for us to understand that we'll have to build our strength and our abilities to deal with. And talking about climate crisis and not talking about the fact or the emotional price that we all going to pay, I think it's talking about seeing only half or part of the problem, because our emotional way to deal with that will affect our ability to deal with that in a good way, I mean, and to do the right thing. If we're not emotionally strong enough, we cannot get the right decisions, we cannot help ourselves, we cannot help the situation. So it's a one thing that we have to understand, that it's all connected to the same idea, and we'll have to put attention or pay attention for that, for our mental health as well, dealing with the climate crisis. Thank you. I hope I didn't run, I don't know. I hope it was clear enough. And I enjoyed, I hope you too. It's 4 o'clock. Should I do something with it? I'm not sure. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
בשאיפה, כמו פיליפ לייצג איזה חברת שעוסקת בניהול סביבתי, זה אפילו בהיבט כלכלי, אבל כאן יכולה לתת איזושהי גישה ביולוגית סביבתית לעניין הזה. אז מה זה תעשייה? בעיקרון גם אין לי בעיה להישאר, זאת אם זה היה נשמע הייתי נשאר גם לדוקטורט, אבל אני חושבת שיש שאיפה ליותר מזה. אני כבר בנת מסע הצד. אמרתי, באמת לשאול אותך, אולי את מכירה מישהו אפילו מכאן, או מהנדסה לצורך העניין, שכאילו יש לו איזושהי השקה, או נתף אולי